Thank you, Ignacy. I feel very honoured to have been invited to address this conference. I also feel rather daunted because I know we have gathered in this room experts from the museum world, along with teachers, academics, students, who know a great deal about the education of young children. And while I'm interested in both these areas, I can't claim to be an expert either in museums or in the education of young children. Indeed, such expertise as I have is mainly in the upper secondary sphere. So when I received the invitation from Ignacy to give this lecture, I wondered, and I asked him, but did he think I'd have anything to say which would be of interest to you? And his response was to say that what he was looking for was, first of all, some reflections on the directions in which science education is heading, and in particular, on the role that research and innovation can play in this. And here I feel on safer ground because, as Ignacy has explained, this is what my foundation has been doing for 50 years or so. So what I'm going to do is offer you some reflections on some of the different ways in which research and innovation can play a role in the development of science and mathematics education. I'm going to describe some examples, most of which, but not all, are taken from our experience at Nuffield. I'm going to talk about three particular areas. I'm going to start by saying a bit more about Nuffield and what we do, and then I'm going to pick three areas. The first is research into the way that children learn and what that can tell us about how we should teach. Second, I'm going to talk a bit about evaluation, how we can tell whether the innovations we're pursuing are successful or not. And lastly, I'm going to say a bit about research that informs policy on the larger scale. So, the Nuffield Foundation. Well, it was set up in 1943 by a man called William Morris. He was a motor car manufacturer. He made a fortune. And later in his life, he became a great philanthropist, one of the greatest philanthropists of the century. As happens in the UK, when people become great people, we call them lords. And he became a lord. And when you become a lord, you take the name of a place. And he took the name of Nuffield, which was a village where he lived, which is near Oxford, where his factories were, and of course, the seat of one of our great universities. And this is him in one of his cars. He's the man behind the steering wheel with the hat on, looking very happy, and why wouldn't he? He's just made a great deal of money. Here is a car that may be more familiar to you. This is a Morris Minor. This is a car that his company made, very common in the UK in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Over 1 million of these cars were made, and they were so common that I had one myself. So the young person there with the hat on is me, and the very young person helping me is my daughter, my older daughter, Julia, who I'm pleased to say has grown up to be, first of all, a scientist, and secondly, somebody who is in love with Spain and all things Spanish. She did an Erasmus year in Madrid, not in Barcelona, I'm afraid. And right at the moment, she's in Guatemala doing research. So, Nuffield wanted his foundation to contribute to improvements in society, including the expansion of education and the reduction of disadvantage. He called this the advancement of social well-being. He was convinced of the importance of education, training, and research in bringing about improvements in society, and that remains the core object and mission of our foundation. He died in 1963, but we still carry on the same mission. Something about the size, we are quite small, strangely, certainly compared with La Caixa. We have an endowment of about 400 million euros. We spend about 15 million euros a year, and our main objective is, you can read, to improve social well-being by funding research and innovation in education and social policy. I'd make 2 points. One is that we are completely independent. We have no dependence on the state. We don't raise money. We're free to follow our own noses. And that's really very important. But the second is that we nearly always work in partnership with other organizations, and I shall mention some of those as we go along. What we do, we spend about 80% of the funds are spent on grants, the rest on our own in-house programs, including a program in science and maths education. And we do broadly 2 things. The first is we support research and development in policy, to inform policy and practice. And secondly, we make some direct grants to support young people. I just want to pause on that phrase, policy and practice. It's a phrase we use a lot. What it means is really 2 things. If you want to improve the world you work in, whether it's education or law or social policy, there are 2 key actors. The first is the people who are actually doing the job, the teachers, the social workers, the lawyers. That's what we would call practice. But practice takes place in the context of policy, which is a national framework, if you like. And we feel that if you want to make long-term changes, you need to address both. Now, of course, they interact with each other, and research has things to say to both. We find, I don't know if there are people from universities here, but we find that researchers are not very good at talking to practitioners or policymakers, and part of our role is to help make sure that dialogue happens. So, the Foundation has been active in science and mathematics education for about 50 years, and I think it's fair to say that we have had quite an influence nationally. Can I just ask, for a show of hands, how many people here have actually heard of the Nuffield Foundation in the context of science and mathematics? Very few. Well, that's very interesting. Good. Okay, that's good to know that. So I will tell you more. If you'd known, I would have stopped there. But okay, so it started a long time ago in the 1960s when the Foundation began to develop teaching materials for pupils in secondary schools, first in physics, then in biology, then in chemistry. The original courses were aimed at students from 11 to 16, and particularly aimed at brighter students, more able students. But over time, other courses followed, both for older and younger pupils, and for pupils of a wide range of abilities. Now, at the time, science syllabuses hadn't changed for many, many years and were very old-fashioned. So one of the objectives was to develop courses that were more up-to-date and that reflected modern science as it was being practiced, and not science of 100 years ago, which was what was being taught. But beyond that, and more important, I think, was that the courses were rooted in the idea that pupils should be active learners who were encouraged to think and work things out for themselves and not just to be given facts and theories to remember. A key part of this was the development of practical work that was carried out by the pupils themselves in their classrooms or school laboratories. Previously, this rarely happened. Pupils were given lectures, basically. The nearest they came to practical work was seeing a demonstration carried out in front of them by the teacher. So this idea of developing new experiments for the pupils to do was very new, and it was the beginning of what we now call inquiry-based learning. This all happened on a large scale. New practical apparatus was developed, new pedagogies were developed, new assessment methods. It was all tried out in schools, it was trialed, there was evaluation, and eventually it was written up in books that were disseminated largely to schools. And many of these books were translated, including into, where are we? Sorry, I missed that one. Into Spanish. So there we are. That's a translation of one of the early Nuffield books. I don't know if you can read the... Anyway, you can see it's Spanish. And there's good old Darwin sitting there. I saw him on the way in with his long beard. That's Darwin when he was a bit younger. All of this material is still available. There are two resources I want to point you to. The first is the Nuffield Foundation's website, which we've just restored and rebuilt. We're very proud of it. It's very whizzy. It has on it a lot of resources, not just in science, in mathematics, in design and technology, for different ages. It's all free, and it's reasonably easy to find. So do have a look at that. That's the URL at the top. There's a second resource, which is this. Again, this is their web page. This is called the National STEM Centre in the UK. The idea here was to put together a library of all the many resources that had been developed over the years, not just by us, but by all kinds of people. It's a terrific resource. It's all free, and do have a look. Okay, so moving on to, that's all about curriculum development. I now want to talk about research. Now, research takes many different forms. I'm not going to try and give you a comprehensive picture. I just want to talk about three areas, and the first of these is research into how children learn. So, what we're all doing, whether we're in schools or in museums or in the public domain, is to try and engage children and young people with science and mathematics and to help them to learn. It's simple. But it's pretty clear that whatever the age of the child, a child's mind is not, as it were, an empty bucket. It's not an empty bucket into which we pour things until it's full. It's a much more dynamic, much more subtle, and much more complex process. And one of the most powerful theories about the way children learn comes from the actually rather simple idea that children come to education with their own ideas, their own ways of learning, and their own ways of looking at the world. For young children, that way of looking at the world will be very intuitive. It will be based on the limited experience they've had in their short lives to date. It won't be scientific. And one of the purposes of science education is to move the child's thinking from that intuitive picture to something closer to a scientific way of thinking and looking at the world. It's a very simple, but I think a very powerful insight. And one of the great figures in science education in the United Kingdom was someone called Ros Driver, who sadly died some years ago. She summed it up when she said, "It's the coherence as perceived by the pupil that matters in learning. It's as important in teaching and curriculum development to consider and understand children's own ideas as it is to give a clear presentation of the conventional scientific theories." And this idea, which is known in the trade as constructivism, provided the thinking behind a large project that the Foundation funded in the 1980s. It was called the SPACE project. SPACE stands for Science, Processes and Concept Exploration. That was led by two very important figures in the UK, Paul Black and Wyn Harlan. The idea, as I've explained, was that children come with their own ideas about the scientific concepts that we're trying to engage them with, so that if we can find out what those ideas are and challenge them, we're beginning to give them a way in which their learning can be more robust and firmer. Let me give you an example. One of the difficult concepts that children have to come to terms with is the idea of continuous change, and in particular, the continuous growth of living things. So if you have in your classroom a plant that grows fast, like a bean, a runner bean, you can see that day to day, that plant gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you say to a young child, "When does the plant grow?" many children will say it grows at night. Why do they say that? Because they know it grows, but they can't see it grow. So if they say that, you can, in a sense, challenge what they're saying by saying, okay, let's do an experiment. Let's measure the bean first thing in the morning. Let's measure it when we go home at night. Is it the same height? No, it's grown. They may say, of course, that it's grown during the lunch break. But there we are. But having discovered that there are lots of ideas, there are lots of ways in which children have these basic ideas. And what the space project did was to investigate children's ideas across the whole range of primary science. They used different techniques to find out what the children thought. They asked them to write, they asked them to speak, but they also asked them to draw. And here's an example. The question here is, what happens to food inside your body? And you can see that this child thinks that there are 3 different tubes. This one takes the food, and there it is. There's an apple or something. This one takes the air, and this one takes the drink, and there's the lemonade. That's fairly typical. Now, here's another one. I love this one. I love it because it's just such a lovely drawing. But this is actually a rather more sophisticated picture. You see that this says stomach, and here's the child has got an idea that here is the food in the stomach. But also, look, here are these arrows showing that the food somehow gets into the rest of the body, and indeed out the end, as it were. I've no idea what this is, or this is. But one of the nice things you can do is you can ask the child, what is that? Tell me about it. Explain it to me. And that's what they did. And it's worth just looking in a bit more detail at this. So what they were trying to do was, first of all, to enable children to test their own ideas through practical hands-on experiments, explorations, and so on. Secondly, to encourage generalization from one context to another by experiencing and considering other instances. For example, you can look at the evaporation of water, but then you can say, well, what about other liquids? What about lemonade or oil or whatever? Next, discuss the words that children use with them. So, going back to the drawing, the stomach. What is the stomach? Extend the range of evidence that's available to children to help them find ways of making the invisible visible, for example, by using models and simulations. And by helping children to communicate their ideas, both with the teacher, but also with each other. And as you can see, these ideas go a long way further than just explaining scientific concepts and theories and facts. They're about extending the range of skills and processes that the children use, the processes of the title. And arguably, I would say, these processes, these ways of thinking, are much more important, particularly for young children, than the specific pieces of science that they pick up on the way. And that, I think, was a central idea of this project. Now, all of that was written up in a series of publications. The research reports, this one is on, as you can see, rocks, soil, and weather. The research reports, there was one for each of these areas. I think there's about 12 in all. And then there were teachers' guides, which were written up, first of all, for younger children, and then for the older children at primary level. And all of those kinds of things I've been talking about are in there, and they're all available on our website, as I explained. And interestingly, the Nuffield website has a lot of material on it. These reports are still among the most popular downloaded reports that we have, even after 20 years. Okay, I want to move on now and talk about a second way in which research can influence what we do, and that's evaluation. So if we start a new project or a new way of teaching about science, or even if we're thinking about something we've been doing for a long time, I think there's a couple of simple questions we should always ask ourselves. And the first is, how are we getting on? And in the world of evaluation, this is called summative evaluation. It asks questions like, are we achieving our aims? How successful are we? Are we meeting our targets? It seems very straightforward, and I'd start from the assumption that all of us as professionals would want to know the answers to these questions. We want to do a good job. We want to know that we're doing a good job. But it's worth adding that these summative questions are increasingly being asked by others. So in the UK, for example, budgets are tight, I'm sure they are here, and funders and others are increasingly asking these questions. I guess they want to know, not just that it's a good thing, but they want to know about value for money. And in the modern world, this means evidence. It means real, robust, objective evidence. So exciting stories and pictures of smiling children and the enthusiasm of people like you and me is no longer enough, I think. People want evidence. The second question is how can we improve? And in the jargon, this is called formative evaluation. And this is aimed at asking questions that will help us do things better. Maybe some bits of the project are working well and others less well. Why is that? What are the reasons? Can that tell us things which will help us to improve and do things better? Of course, as professionals, we ask these questions all the time. But the evaluation, the idea of evaluation, is that you do this in a more structured, a more formal way, and probably more self-consciously. And that's the case with an evaluation I want to tell you about, which we've been carrying out on one of our own grant schemes. And this is something of a salutary tale. So this scheme that we've been running at the Foundation now for a number of years is called the Science Bursary Scheme. And what we do is we give grants to upper secondary students, so 17-year-olds, who do research projects during the summer vacation. These projects are quite long. They last for 4 to 6 weeks, so basically the whole of the vacation. And these students, they go and work in universities, in research institutes, in museums like this one, in private companies, and so on. We fund more than 1,000 students a year, so it's quite a big project, big scheme. And these are very bright, committed students who nearly all go on to study science at universities. And if you'd like to know more about it, there's the URL. And here are some of the students. And there they are. I don't know exactly what they did, but I do know that they all look very happy, as you can see. And some of them do extraordinary things. Now, this student here, Hannah Blythe, this summer was working, as you can see, at an observatory and took part in a project where they discovered 20 new asteroids. And she's going to have one named after her. Now, how exciting is that, to have a 17-year-old having an asteroid named after her? So the scheme works very well. It's very popular, both with the students and with the scientists who are terrifically impressed by these bright young people who work with them. We all love the scheme. But we wanted to dig a bit deeper and to see if we were really achieving what we wanted to achieve. And in particular, we wanted to ask about the kinds of students that we were recruiting. We suspected that we were getting more students from better-off families and not so many students from poorer families. Why does that matter? Because we wanted to add value with this scheme. We wanted to be able to say that the experiences that we were giving to these students was making a difference. And you can make that case much more easily, I think, if you've got children who are struggling to follow the academic path through to university and higher education. So we recruited a team to help us do an evaluation. They've been working on this over the summer and will be working with us for the next year or two. They've been talking to the students, they've been talking to the scientists, their teachers, and so on. There's a lot of detail they've come up with, but I just wanted to pick out one of their findings. Now, this would take a bit of explanation, but I think it makes the point. This chart here shows, I should explain, in the UK, we have a system called free school meals. So if you come from a family where the family income is below a certain level, you're entitled to have free meals at school. So because it's linked to income, it's an indicator of how poor or how well off a family is. And what this chart shows is the proportion of children receiving free school meals in schools. So here we have and up here we have the proportion of schools. So as you can see, something like 25% of schools have fewer than 5% of children on free school meals. Getting on for 30% have between 5 and 10%, and so it works down. So here, a school that has nearly a third of its children on free school meals, there would be about 5% of schools in the country in that group. So that distribution gives you a picture of the distribution of wealth in UK schools. So we wanted to know how were we doing relative to that chart, and this is the answer. And as you can see, it's a very stark picture because it shows that nearly over 60% of the schools where our scheme operates are in this band here, and very many fewer down here. So that finding has affected the way we think about this school profoundly. It's told us that although we love the scheme, everybody loves the scheme, lots of smiling students, actually we're not hitting the target we mean to hit. And not only has it told us that, it's also told us what we need to do, which is the scheme is organized regionally. We have regional coordinators. They now have a task, which is to find the schools of this kind, and we can help them do that, and to make sure now that the placements are much better balanced relative to that distribution. And our target is within a year, well, probably 2 years, to have the target, the blue chart, looking the same as the red chart. There's a lot more to it than that, but the point I want to make is that here is an evaluation that has really profoundly changed how we think about this scheme and how we're going to run it in the future. So I'd like to draw out 3 general points about evaluation and the role it plays and how we do it. The first is about objectivity. In my view, when you're evaluating, you should always, always get an outside view. It doesn't mean by that, I don't mean by that, that you must always find an external consultant to do your evaluation for you. Many things we do are far too small, they don't justify that. But getting an outside view, getting someone who's not part of the team to come and tell you what they think is always worthwhile. And there are 3 good reasons, I think. The first is objectivity. We work hard to develop our projects, our teaching, and our ways of working. We believe in them, and we love them. But because of that, it's very easy, because of that passion, it's very easy for us to develop blind spots and to miss or to overlook things that will be evident to others. And I think the example I've shown you shows that. The second reason, again rather obvious, is that outside people will bring new ways of thinking, new experience, new knowledge to bear. And the third reason, which is perhaps less obvious, is that an outside opinion is always more influential with others. So if I go and talk to you and I say, tell me about your project, and you say it's wonderful, I think, I like the passion, but do I really believe the person? They would say that, wouldn't they? Whereas if you can say to me, look, here's Dr. X, and he's done an evaluation, and he thinks it's great, that carries much more weight. The second point is about methods. If you get into the research literature on evaluation, I advise you not to. It's actually rather boring. There's a lot of it. But you will see there are lots of discussions about the differences between quantitative and qualitative evaluation. There are wars about this. The quantitative social scientists don't like the qualitative social scientists. My view of this is very pragmatic. I think Both methods have their place. It depends on the kind of question you're asking. Broadly speaking, if you want to know what is happening, you tend towards quantitative methods. If you want to know why it's happening, you probably need qualitative methods. So for the example I gave you, the picture about the distribution of schools could only come from large-scale quantitative data, counting up the numbers. But if we want to know why it is that those students from poorer families are not coming onto the scheme, we probably need to talk to them. And that means qualitative methods. The third point is proportionality. I don't know how that translates into Spanish, I'm sorry. I think it's very important to be realistic about what an evaluation can tell you. And I'm afraid we have to be aware that some of the questions we would dearly like to have answers to are actually not answerable, or at least not answerable in reasonable timeframes and with reasonable levels of resources. And there is actually quite interesting literature on this. There's a kind of hierarchy of things you can think about. So something like this. First question, suppose you've put on an event or you've started a new scheme for science teaching. First question, did people come? Well, you'll know this from your basic monitoring. Secondly, attitudes and responses. Did people like it? What did they like? What did they not like? How do they think it could be improved? Their feedback questionnaires have their place. Next question, did they learn anything? This is much tougher. So people turn up, they smile, they have a nice time, they buy the souvenir pencil. But did it make any difference? Did they learn anything? Now, to find that out, you have to do some kind of testing. Whether it's oral or written, you have to do some kind of testing. But suppose they know something. Did it last? What happened 6 months later? Had they forgotten it all? To find that out, you have to go back and do what's called a post-test. You have to go back 6 months later and administer the test again. That's expensive. If you try and find the students, you'll probably lose some of them on the way. So that takes a long time, that costs money. But the last one, this is the holy grail. Did it change behavior? Did the event or the scheme, or like our bursary scheme, did it actually make any difference to the way people behave? This is very hard to answer. It usually needs longitudinal data, that's to say, data that you gather over a period of time. And even if you have it, it's very difficult to attribute cause. How do you know that a change in behavior was caused by what you did rather than something else? Very hard to do, and really only worth doing for very big and expensive projects. But despite that rather gloomy conclusion, I would say that it's always worth thinking about evaluation. And I would say that it's worth it, perhaps not because of what you learn afterwards, so much as the way it makes you think about things before you start. So I think that any project should start by asking two questions. What are we trying to achieve? But more important, how will we recognize if we've achieved it? What evidence will persuade us that we have been successful? We now ask people who apply to the Nuffield Foundation for grants to address this question explicitly. Tell us, how will you know? What will satisfy you that you have been successful? There's rarely a clear or simple answer to that. But it's the process of thinking about it, I think, that makes the difference. And if people haven't thought about it, I think that's a bad sign. There's someone we work with a lot in the UK, a man called Professor Robin Miller of the University of York, I'm going to mention him again in a minute, has taken this idea and applied it to classroom teaching in what I think is a very, very interesting way. He's interested in teaching at lower secondary level, so 11 to 14-year-olds. He's a physicist, and he's interested to start with in teaching about energy. And his approach is not to say, how should we teach about energy? His approach is to say, what would we want? What do we reasonably think a 14-year-old should know, could know about energy, and how would we know that they knew it? So he starts, in other words, with the assessment at the end. He starts with the tests that he wants to give students at the end of this course of study. He then works back to say, well, if that's where we want to get them to, what's the teaching we need to do to achieve that result? This project has just started. I think it's very interesting because it's completely the other way round from what we normally do. Normally, we develop the materials and then think, how shall we test it? This is the other way around. I think it's a fascinating idea, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what comes from it. Excuse me. The last theme I want to address is research that influences policy. Unlike the previous two themes, this is not about a particular kind of research. Any sort of research can have an influence on policy, including, I'm sorry to say, bad research. And I say that partly as a joke, but actually it's very serious. There are plenty of instances where developments in education have been driven by what is actually rather sloppy research, and that's something we need to be careful of. The development I want to describe to you, which has had a profound influence on policy in the UK, and I think more widely, started with a really very small exercise, which quickly escalated and led to addressing some very big issues. In fact, I think some of the biggest issues that face science education at the moment. This all started with a suggestion by Ros Driver, who I mentioned earlier, that the foundation should fund a series of seminars, which it did. This was in 1998, and they led to the publication of this report called Beyond 2000. This report was written by Jonathan Osborne, who's now professor at Stanford in the US, and Robin Miller, who I've just been mentioning. I think it's one of the most important pieces of work in the field for years. What started it, where it started, was this, that this is very much a UK-focused initiative, where science had been what we call a core subject in the national. We have a national curriculum in the UK, and science had become a core subject for about 10 years, which means that it was taught alongside maths and English as something that everybody had to do. And in fact, most students, secondary students, were now spending about 20% of curriculum time following a science course. Now that was a big change and a big, it put science education very much up the agenda. It'd been going on for about 10 years, and the organisers of the seminar wanted to ask, started off with that first question: what are the successes and the failures of science education to date in the UK? In other words, a kind of summative question. But they quickly moved on to ask the second and third questions, which I think are much more profound and much more interesting. That's to say, what is science education for? Who is it for? Why do we do it? And then, having addressed that question, what might be the content and structure of a science education that was suitable for all? And asking that second question led them to consider two rather uncomfortable ideas. The first idea was that science education actually has two purposes. The first is to provide the early stage of training for young people who will go on to follow careers in science. I suspect most of the people in this room would be in that category. But the second aim, the second objective, is to provide a basic understanding of science and science processes that will equip all future citizens to lead their lives in a world where science and technology is so important and where they have to make decisions and come to conclusions that are going to affect their lives. And they need some science and technology understanding to work with that, to do that. The phrase that's sometimes used is science literacy. Not a term I much like, but you'll see it in the literature. So why is this uncomfortable? Well, it's uncomfortable because what they realized, and became very clear from the work they did, was that the curriculum, certainly in the UK, had been designed almost entirely to meet the needs of the first group, even though that first group, those who are going on to science, form actually a rather small minority, probably no more than 10 or 20% of students at the most. And I think this rather long quotation sums it up nicely. This is from the report that Ignacy mentioned at the beginning, Science Education in Europe, which is a kind of distillation of some of the arguments here. What they say is this: whilst there is agreement that an education in science is important for all school students, nobody disputes that, there's been little debate about its nature and its structure. Rather, curricula have evolved from pre-existing forms. Predominantly, these curricula have been determined by scientists who perceive school science as a basic preparation for a science degree. In short, a route into science. Our contention is that such an education does not meet the needs of the majority of students, who require a broad overview of the major ideas that science offers, how it produces reliable knowledge, and the limits to certainty. Now that, for Nuffield, of course, is quite an indictment, because these curricula determined by scientists were the ones that we were developing in the 1960s and the 1970s. And it's true. Those projects were developed at least as much by practicing scientists as they were by teachers. So that's the first uncomfortable idea. The second is that in the developed world, at least, there is strong evidence that these existing science curricula are not succeeding in engaging the interest of young people. And again, to quote this report, both the content and the pedagogy associated with such curricula are increasingly failing to engage young people with the further study of science. Indeed, there's a strong negative correlation between students' interest in science and their achievement in science tests. So what it's saying is, not only are these curricula not well designed for the majority, they're not even succeeding in their primary task of attracting the minority. And there's a lot of evidence for this, and I'm just going to show you two pieces. The first, this is a complex chart, but it's a very interesting one. These data come from something called the ROSE study, R-O-S-E, which is a large-scale study that was carried out by researchers in Norway, Svein Sjöberg and his colleagues. And what they did was they carried out a lot of attitude questionnaires, attitude surveys in, I think it's now up to something like 60 countries around the world. And they asked 15-year-old students, boys and girls, a lot of questions about their attitudes to science, what they liked, what they didn't like, whether they felt positive about science, what kinds of science they liked, and particularly whether they themselves thought that they might become scientists, or whether they thought that in some way science was for them. And this is just one of many charts in the study. And what it shows is the response to the question, I would like to become a scientist. And the percentage, which is along the x-axis, is the percentage who said, yes, I agree, or yes, I strongly agree. And down the left-hand side are lots of countries where they did this study. The reds are the girls, and the blues are the boys. Am I right? No, the other way around. Sorry. Yes, the reds are the girls, and the blues are the boys. Yes. Yeah, okay. So what does it show? Well, what it shows, I mean, this is one of many charts showing a very similar picture. And what you can see is, first of all, that in these countries here, it's very strongly skewed to the left. In other words, there's not much enthusiasm for the idea that I might like to be a scientist. But what's so interesting is how as you move up, it shifts over to the right. And up here are these poorer countries in Africa and Asia and so on. The attitudes are very much more positive. And in fact, just to use some numbers for a moment, there is a 0.92 negative correlation between how positive these children feel about science and the UN index of deprivation. In other words, in the wealthy, developed countries, the attitudes of children, of young people towards science, are very much less positive than they are in poorer countries. And as you can see, there are quite big differences between boys and girls, and those are also very interesting to look at. So that's the Rose study. The second one really shows the same point. These are data from TIMSS. You know the TIMSS surveys are surveys which are done of attainment, achievement this is not attitudes, but achievement in science and mathematics, again in lots of countries. I say not attitudes, but there are some questions about attitudes, and here you see very much the same picture. So up here, on the y-axis, you have the average score of the countries. So up here you've got countries that do very well in these tests, Korea, Japan, Australia, and so on, Hong Kong, and so on. Down here you've got the countries that do much less well. And along here you have the percentage of students who are scoring high on an attitude question. And as you can see, the same picture. Basically, the better they do, the less positive they feel about it. Now, that is a shocking finding, and it's a robust one. So, back to the Beyond 2000 report, it had a big effect in the UK. Not least, I think, because at the time there was, and there remains, a lot of anxiety among the scientific community about public fears and indeed public hostility towards science. This was on the back of scandals like the BSE, mad cow outbreak, and worries about, for example, about vaccination and numbers of people taking up vaccines going down and so on. So the science community, I think, was in a mood to be receptive to the idea that one of the key purposes of science education should be to give everybody a sense of scientific literacy and not just be about training the next generation. And it led to, the Beyond 2000 report led to a lot of development activity, which we were very involved in. And we developed a new course called 21st Century Science, which is a course for upper secondary 14 to 16-year-old students, which is now taken by about a quarter of the schools in England. And that course deliberately set out to respond to those two challenges. The first, the observation that pupils' experience of science education too often take the form of disconnected facts which don't add up to any kind of coherent story or picture in the students' minds. And Jonathan Osborne describes it as being on a journey in a train where the windows are blacked out. And occasionally a window is opened and you look out and you see something and then it's closed again. Only the driver knows where you're going. Only the driver knows where you've gone. And that's kind of captures the experience for lots of students. So to quote the Beyond 2000 report, they say the current curriculum retains its past mid-20th century emphasis, presenting science as a body of knowledge which is value-free, objective and detached, a succession of facts to be learned with insufficient indication of any overarching coherence. So what the course set out to do was, first of all, to concentrate on a small number of the really big ideas in science, particularly those ideas that have very powerful explanatory value. And second, and perhaps more radically, was the idea that students needed to know not just about the facts and theories of science, but also about how science works. And that phrase, how science works, has become an important part of the way we think about science education. So again, to quote the report, young people need an understanding of how scientific inquiry is conducted to help them appreciate the reasoning which underpins scientific knowledge claims. So the course includes a lot of this kind of material. material about data and its limitations, about correlation and cause, about the nature of theories, about the nature of the scientific community and the way it works, about risk, and about how one makes decisions about science and technology. This area has been much more difficult and much more contentious. I won't go into detail, but you can see that some of these ideas about science look fairly familiar. They're the kinds of things that you would expect in any science course, about, particularly the ones at the top, about data and so on. But as you go on further down the list, you get into much more difficult territory, where you're asking teachers to engage with controversial and possibly difficult ideas. And that has been much more difficult. And I'd observe that I think we got two things wrong with this course. The first is that we didn't think nearly enough about the demands on teachers, which we took them into territory where they felt uncomfortable, and we didn't pay enough attention to that. And secondly, we didn't think nearly enough about assessment. And the assessments for these courses were not good. So, I'd like to conclude with one final observation, which I think takes us almost back to the first example. I think what the debates around the Beyond 2000 report and what's happened since have made people aware of two very important ideas. The first is the strong evidence that young people's interest in science develops very early. There's evidence which I'm not going to quote here, but that by the age of 14 or thereabouts, children have pretty much made up their minds. This is a quote from the Science Education in Europe report. Whilst student interest in science at age 10 has been shown to be high, with no gender difference, by age 14 it's declined markedly. Recent research would suggest that for the majority of students, interest in pursuing further study of science has largely been formed by the time children are 14. And what that means, I think, is that the experiences that children have in the early part of their education are crucial. As the older they get, the progressively harder it gets to engage them if they're not already interested. But the fact is that we know very little about what it is that leads children to be interested in science or not. And one very interesting analysis, which again comes from the people who did the Rose study, is that we need to be thinking much more about what happens to young people in their lives generally, not just what happens in the classroom. These young people, they're in their teens, their early teens. They're forming their own identity, their own sense of themselves. And they live in a society where they have autonomy, where they have choice. That's the difference, I think. One of the big differences between the developed countries, think back to that Rose study, the developed countries and the developing countries, that the young people in our societies have a lot of choice. They can see that they can make their own world, they can make their own lives. So whether they see science as being for them is part of their own self-identity. So that they need, having the option to choose, they're looking not just at, do I find it interesting, but is it me? Is it part of what I am, the way I see myself? And I'd like to conclude with this quote from Russell Tytler, who's an Australian academic, which I think gets to the heart of what I think is a really serious dilemma for science education in the developed world. He says the problem lies in a mismatch between the science curriculum, contemporary practice in science, and the lives and interests of students in post-industrial societies. I think that's the heart of the problem we are facing at the moment. And I wanted to conclude not with a problem, but with something a bit more positive. And so I go back to this picture. As I was getting on the metro, the tube, the subway in London to get on the plane to come here today, I picked up, we have a free newspaper called The Metro. And as I was just leafing through it, my eye was caught by this. You won't be able to see it, but that's a nice picture of Hannah. There she is. So she's in the newspaper, and she's been included in a shortlist of young women of the future. So there she is, discovered her asteroids, and there she is alongside the would-be pop singers and fashion people and people who want to set up restaurants and so on. And there she is doing her science and enjoying it and being a young person that other young people can relate to. I think that, I don't know quite what the message is out of that, but I feel strangely enthused by it, and I can't wait to meet her. Thank you.
Yo soy Julieta Fierro, la señora que viene de México. Hello. I have 3 questions for you. In the first place, how did you solve the digestion problem? Because Mom fixed wonderful food for us, and the outcome is really horrible. Second, we try to have these students come in with a scientist to work, but scientists don't find enough easy stuff for them to do, because we do research that requires a certain language, and even less children if they go into industries, which we thought would be great for them. But it hasn't worked. The people in industries don't want to have them. And the third question is, you scarcely spoke about fundraising, and you said you had a very good scheme for doing it. I wonder if one of your booklets is about fundraising.
Okay. How did we solve the digestion problem? I'm afraid I don't know. But if you have a look in one of the books that I showed you, I'm sure that it will talk through that. I mean, I agree. I put the examples up because I just think they're lovely examples. I don't know the answer. Students as scientists, that's interesting. We have not found it so difficult. We have over 1,000 students a year, and I think we could go much bigger. It's true that there are quite serious limitations on what students can do, but I think it's partly about giving guidance to the scientists about what you can reasonably expect a 17-year-old to do, and what you can reasonably expect in the time. Very few of them go wrong, and very few students say that they have had been given a project they can't cope with. So I don't know the answer. I don't know what it is that that distinguishes and makes it possible for this to work, but it does. And so all I can say is it does.
Students are happy, but researchers are fed up.
Ours are not. And what an important indicator for us is do the scientists come back the following year? If the scientists have a bad experience, they don't do it again. But most of ours do. They do come back. So they're that. On fundraising, well, it's not an issue for Nuffield because we have our own funds. But we do work in partnership with others, and we do raise additional funds. So, for example, the 21st Century Science Project had 4 or 5 major funders. I think, from that point of view, we are very well networked, and because we are respected, people, other funders look at what we're doing and say, if Nuffield is taking it seriously, perhaps we should too. We go through quite formal and rigorous processes of applying for grants to run alongside our schemes. So, for example, the bursary scheme, which I described, has funding from at least 3 other sources, and we apply for grants like others do. I think our reputation helps. And I think the fact that we are always doing new things helps. But sorry, that's probably all I can say on that.
Gracias. Julieta Fierro es investigadora de astrofísica de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, que tiene una ponencia mañana a las 12 sobre niños, educación científica y el futuro de la sociedad. Será la ponencia de clausura. Gracias por la intervención. ¿Alguna pregunta? Ana Correas, de Fundación de FECIT.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Ana Correas, and I come from the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology. And, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for this beautiful explanation and projects you develop at the Foundation. We, at the Foundation here in Spain, carry out a very similar project that you carry out there in England, the bursaries. Our program is called Científica Summer Campus.
A common program, you mean?
Yeah, this is a very important point. We develop in collaboration with Obra Social Caixa. And my question is, how do you select the students? Because, for instance, in our case, the participants this year came up at 1,200 students participated in 20 different Spanish universities, working in research projects at those universities, and we got up to 7,000 applications. It was very difficult for us to select the students. And how did you select?
Did you say 7,000?
7,000, up to 7,000 students, applications.
For how many places?
1,200.
Right. The way we run our scheme, it's run locally. So we have 20 coordinators around the country who look after the scheme in their own areas. We do that because we think local conditions are very important, and we, working centrally, can't know those. And as part of that, we have allowed, indeed encouraged, the coordinators to develop their own methods. So the methods vary from place to place. I think a key issue here is the school. The way I would like it to go, the way it goes in some areas but not others, is that the school itself plays a part in nominating students. So students don't go directly to the scheme, they go through the school. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it would help with selection, and it would help with that problem that you're talking about. So if every school knew, for example, that every year it had 2 places, it would select its 2 students and put them forward. But there's another reason why I think that's important, and it's this, that one of the weaknesses of our scheme, I think, is that the students have a great time, but it's only one student. And I think we're missing something, because I think we can use the experience of those students to influence other students, pupils in those schools, particularly the younger students. So I would like to see a situation with our scheme where every school, ideally, particularly the more difficult, more challenging schools, knows that every year it can put forward 2, 3, 4 students. And there's a competition for those places. And every year, those students have the experience, and then they come back and they talk to the younger students, particularly the very young students, so that it becomes a part of the school's natural cycle. So in the UK, schools have sports teams. And it's part of the school ethos that every year the school team in football or cricket or whatever, the school knows about it. They have orchestras, they have art exhibitions. I would like to see science being there alongside that. And it seems to me that doing it in this way through the schools is a way of achieving that, so that one would have long-term relationships, both within the school, so that the younger children are listening to and learning from the older children, but also as the children move forward into university. Those kids who've gone to universities, maybe from families where nobody had been to university before. So it can be a very powerful influence on the younger children who are thinking, well, maybe should I or shouldn't I? I think we underestimate how important students are as examples for other students. So I showed you Hannah with her telescope. I think she's an inspiration for me, but I would like to see her being an inspiration for the 13 and 14-year-old girls in her school who say, I could do that. So, sorry, that's a rather long answer. Yeah. But I think linking it through the schools, fundamentally, there are very good reasons why that's a good way to do it.
Sí, es muy interesante como realmente tenemos un programa muy parecido que parte de FECIT con el Ministerio de Educación y que nosotros hemos apoyado por primera vez este año, que es exactamente unos campus científicos de verano en campus de excelencia universitarios con 1.200 alumnos y es un programa prácticamente igual, además en número, del que tiene la Nuffield Foundation. Y yo creo que hemos aprendido mucho sobre el alcance y la distribución entre escuelas y el bienestar de esas escuelas. Si tiene bueno, yo creo que sería algo que tendríamos que valorar. Así que por lo menos hoy ya hemos aprendido algo, por lo menos algunos de nosotros, seguro que muchos de vosotros también. Yo creo que ha sido, muchas gracias, que no lo he dicho antes, pero una ponencia muy interesante. Yo creo que hay muy buenas recomendaciones tanto para los educadores como para los museólogos. Hay la diapositiva sobre lo que nos tenemos que preguntar respecto a educación científica. Tengo la intuición de que es algo muy parecido a lo que nos tenemos que preguntar para hacer una nueva sala de un museo de ciencia, probablemente. Estoy viendo a nuestra gente de exposiciones por ahí, que está tomando nota. Y yo también, si hay alguna pregunta, por favor, hacerla y yo ya la haré. Bueno, yo quería hacer una, pero no sé si tenemos, a ver si he conseguido recuperar un archivo que me hacía gracia enseñar, porque ha habido un momento que, Anthony, you were talking about the necessary step from intuitive knowledge of the young children to scientific knowledge, and I think I have an example for that. This is my own child, as your child was there before. Let me see if I can.
Pujar ja al cel i llavors amb l'escombra obriré el sol.
Con la escoba abriré el sol.
I per què vols obrir el sol?
¿Por qué quieres abrir el sol?
Per veure què hi ha dins.
Para ver qué hay dentro. Estaba teniendo una conversación, vi que se estaba poniendo interesante, enseguida cogí el aparato y la grabé. O sea, tenía una escoba y estaba hablando de subir al cielo con la escoba. Yo pensaba que era algo sobre brujas o cualquier cosa, pero no, se trataba de ir al cielo, abrir el sol y ver qué había dentro. O sea, esto en una niña de 4 años, ¿cómo se consigue traducir este conocimiento intuitivo en unos científicos? Como que es una tarea interesante. Pero mi pregunta no iba sobre eso. Mi pregunta iba sobre otra cuestión, que es que dentro de las cosas de las que has hablado también de la dificultad de que los investigadores hablen a los profesionales de la educación. Y me preguntaba si tienes alguna experiencia respecto a si los museos pueden tener un papel, los museos de ciencia pueden tener un papel en ese diálogo entre investigadores y profesionales de la educación.
The short answer is definitely. This is. I just hinted at this. It is actually a very important and very difficult area. So you have these 3 communities. You have the practitioners, who may be teachers or maybe museum professionals or people in public communication generally, who are actually a very big community in terms of numbers. You then have policymakers, much smaller in number, and policymakers have their own set of priorities and initiatives and so on. And then you have the researchers. Now, each of these three communities has different priorities, different pressures, different things that drive them. And it doesn't happen naturally that they talk to and listen to each other, I think. Particularly in the UK, researchers these days, what drives them is getting academic papers published. So we, as a funder of research, we have to be very vigorous in requiring the people whose research we fund to take seriously the requirement that they should talk to practitioners and policymakers. But actually that's not enough, because very often they would say, well, we would like to, but we don't know how. We're researchers. We sit in our universities, we do our research, we produce our papers. How can I, as a researcher, go and talk to the minister or go and talk to the senior civil servant who's responsible? Or let alone, how can I talk to lots of teachers? And I think what's crucial there is the role of intermediaries. People whose part of whose job is to make that dialogue happen. Now we see that as a very important part of our work at the Nuffield Foundation. We don't just fund research. We work very hard. We run a lot of conferences, we run working parties, we run seminars, where we invite people along to sessions like this, to hear each other talk. So I think that intermediary role is crucial. Who does it, I think, is, in a sense, not so important. I think it could be a foundation, it could be a museum, it could be a museum that is a foundation. Yeah. What it needs, I think, is it needs three things. It needs independence. I think the crucial thing here is trust. You don't want to be, this role doesn't sit easily with an organization that has a particular agenda, a particular policy that it wants to drive. So independence is crucial. The second thing is probably reputation. So you want a body that is respected by the different parties who are involved, so that they will feel that they can come and speak honestly and openly and not feel that what they're saying may be held against them, whatever. And the third thing you need is money, because if you're going to run events like this, you have to invite people and pay for their fares and feed them and so on. The amount of money is actually quite small. And the way we think about it is this. Suppose we spend 100,000 euros on a research project, and all that produces is an academic paper. Surely it's better to spend another 5,000 euros making sure that the policymakers and the practitioners hear about it, and that it has some effect. So to us, it's an integral part of the process. But could museums do it? Certainly they could. And in the UK, the Science Museum and others play a very important role in this.
As we do, in fact, we have several programs, and right. In that sense, Carme Prats.
Bueno, antes que nada, muchísimas felicidades, porque en los años 70, final de los 70, yo tuve la oportunidad de seguir un curso en el King's College, precisamente de entrenamiento, bueno, un Training Research course sobre temas de investigación en didáctica y en acción educativa. Entonces, al hilo de lo que te acaba de preguntar Ignasi, en aquel momento yo hice una tesis doctoral sobre una exposición de ecología y nos preguntábamos algunas de las cuestiones que ahora planteabas. Una era, cuando la gente va a los museos, ¿aprende algo? Y si aprende algo, ¿qué aprende? Y salió un resultado sorprendente y preocupante. Y es que los que vinieron estudiantes de profesor, de maestros y profesores, fueron los que tuvieron menos buenos resultados en una exposición de ecología que se hacía en un museo. Esto situaba la necesidad de la coherencia entre cómo se explicaban los conceptos científicos en un centro, en una universidad para formar profesores y cómo se explicaban los elementos científicos en un museo donde la educación y la enseñanza es mucho más no formal, ¿no? En este momento yo diría que quizá han evolucionado mucho la manera de explicar las escuelas y las universidades y han evolucionado mucho la manera de presentar los museos de ciencias. Pregunto, ¿puede ser que todavía se dé esta incoherencia? Es decir, que gente de universidad o de estudios que han preparado una asignatura en la escuela no reconozcan ese tema en un museo porque quizá está presentándolo de una manera muchísimo más contemporánea. Esto se podría dar todavía porque este sí que es un problema. Es decir, a la pregunta de Ignasi, ¿de qué manera los museos pueden intervenir en esta formación? Pregunto, ¿de qué manera los museos podemos intervenir en la actualización de los currículums científicos que se dan en las escuelas y universidades y al revés?
Good question.
Gosh. I think I would. I have to say I don't know much about museums other than as a user, as it were. I think a question I
don't know much about education. I know about museums, so we can.
Between us, maybe we can answer. I think a question I would ask myself is, what if you think of exhibitions and projects in museums, what is the audience for those exhibits? It seems to me one of the problems that museums have is that the range of that audience must necessarily be very large. Here we are in this wonderful museum, but you've got young children and older children and their parents and their grandparents all coming in. You have some people who will have had a scientific training, and some people who are going to be teachers of the future, and some who have none of those things. It seems to me that's a very difficult task, and if you compare it with teaching in a class, it must be much simpler in a classroom because you have a class of 13-year-olds and they're all more or less, they're not all the same, of course, they're very different, but compared with the audience in a museum, it's a much more homogeneous group. So, in a way, I mean, what you say is very interesting, but I'm puzzled to know quite how one interprets it. I mean, in a way, it's not surprising that some groups get more out of going to a museum than others. And that seems to be a real challenge for the museum designer. I'm going to pass that over to Ignasi, because that's your business. You can tell me, what is the answer? What exactly? Well, what's the answer to how you think about the audience for what you're doing? It seems to me it's very simple. Well, it's simpler in a classroom. It's very difficult in a museum.
How is it simple in a classroom?
Because the group of people you're talking to is homogeneous. They're all, to some extent, the same.
This is one of the big questions in museology. Which ages, like, for example, the new room in La Cité des Enfants, I would say it's from 3 to 7. Yeah, there is 2. Or 2 to 7. Yeah, there is one for the youngest one and another one for the oldest. Okay, so from 2 to 5 or 6? No. 2 to 7 and another 5 to 12. Okay, so and here at CosmoCaixa Barcelona we have one from, if I'm not wrong, 3 to 6 and 6 to 9. Okay. We call it the click and the flash. So it's a big question in museology, and there's not one answer. Maybe Well, let me introduce you before.
Yes, I'm sorry, because
or yourself,
I'm
please.
Marie-Pierre
Yes.
Lahalle from la Cité des Sciences in Paris, and I'm here to talk about the renovation of la Cité des Enfants, which is a dedicated space for exhibition for children. But to complete the answer of Anthony, I think that the main difference between university or school or so on and museum is not that much the question of homogeneity of the age, but the place itself. I mean, I don't think you can learn something in museum. I'm sorry. I mean, because I don't think that it's the place to learn. It's a sense you can give pleasure of the idea of science. You can develop the curiosity. You can propose an experience that you can't have in school or at home. I mean, this is our philosophy at la Cité des Enfants, to give experience which is completely different as what you can do at school or what you can do at home, and to live a memorable experience and to give a great pleasure that will bring you to the pleasure of experiment and to bring you to l'envie, to want to learn later when you will be older or in another place. But we think that museum science is not really the place to learn in a classic sense. You understand me?
Yes. Well, I would say our philosophy is quite the same. But do you think that schools or the curricula at schools should learn a little bit from that approach
yes,
to
of
science?
course, because it's something different. It's a complementary of what school can give to the children. And usually we are careful of when we are doing an exhibition or whatever the subject to see if there is something common with the program in school, but we don't try to fit completely with the program, school program. It's something more. It's another approach. It's complementary, but it's not a school bis. I mean, it's...
Absolutely. Yeah, Karma? Iba a decir que posiblemente no hayamos respondido, pero creo que sea una cuestión que se puede ir respondiendo durante el día de hoy y mañana.
Molt ràpid. It's for you. What's your name? I agree. Yo estoy completamente de acuerdo en lo que se dice teóricamente. Los museos tienen que ser lugares de emoción, lugares de sorpresa. Yo estoy hablando desde el punto de vista práctico. Y prácticamente el aprendizaje, si tuviéramos que definirlo, en los museos, evidentemente lo que tú puedes hacer es incitar una curiosidad, una serie de preguntas. Esto es lo que yo estaba midiendo en este tema. Y para incitar esta serie de preguntas, esta curiosidad, tienes que tener dos cosas. Uno, atraer hacia allá, y dos, que lo que tú cuentes ahí se entienda. Pero el tema era que lo que yo no la hice la exposición, yo solamente la evaluaba, lo que ahí se contaba no coincidía. Era la ecología más moderna, era del profesor Margalef el concepto, es una especie de premio, ya está muerto, pero fue mi maestro, una especie de premio Nobel. Lo que él contaba era los conceptos más actuales de la ciencia. Y lo que yo estaba planteando era, y él se planteaba, y a él le preocupaba, que no se hubieran reconocido y entendido esos conceptos cuando se venía desde la escuela o desde la universidad de formación de profesores, habiendo preparado la asignatura esta de ecología. Es decir, evidentemente los museos somos lugares donde explicar las últimas novedades de la ciencia. ¿Estas se explican también en las escuelas? Seguramente sí, o todo esto lo estoy diciendo porque hasta ahora yo creía que era fundamental formar profesores con la ayuda de investigadores desde los museos, pero con lo que nos he estado explicando hoy me doy cuenta la importancia también de llegar a los alumnos, pero con el mismo método que se pueda llegar desde las escuelas o lo que tú has contado desde la familia. Este era el punto, pero completamente de acuerdo en, quería definir qué entiendo por educación no formal desde museos.
Muy bien, gracias, Karma. Sí. Última respuesta, si os parece. Ahora tenemos previsto tener una pausa café.
Yo creo que es fundamental enseñar ciencia en los museos, porque los maestros tienen tiempo de estar ahí, usan los laboratorios, tienen información de primera mano, hacen contactos de redes donde les ayudamos a enseñar lo que les gusta. Sí, es un espacio magnífico. Y ese sí es un ejercicio de aprendizaje, a diferencia del visitante casual que va y se divierte y echa relajo.
Muy bien, yo diré, el debate se ha encendido rápido, y yo creo que eso es bueno. Eso es bueno. No, fantástico, muy bien. Si me veis mirando aquí es que se está transmitiendo por Twitter lo que se está diciendo por aquí, y estoy viendo que hay opiniones más en el sentido de Julieta, opiniones más en el sentido de Karma, así que quien quiera seguir el evento por Twitter lo podéis hacer a través de aquel hashtag que aparece por aquí. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Creo que ha sido una ponencia fantástica que ha sentado unos conceptos básicos del panorama de la educación científica en Europa, la importancia de la investigación y de la evaluación, y creo que ha sido una buenísima aportación. Muchas gracias, Anthony y Tomei. Y tenemos una pausa café de 20 minutos, 25 minutos. Gracias.